All right, we're in the Gospel of Mark, and we've been making our way through Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11, the last week of Jesus' life and before the crucifixion. This is his third day in Jerusalem. On the first day, he enters in and comes into the city, what we call the triumphal entry. The second day, he cleanses or clears the temple, all the buying and selling, and declares it a den of robbers. And then on the third day, Jesus himself is confronted about his actions. They challenge him about what he's doing. And that's where we really pick up tonight, Mark chapter 11, and we find ourselves in verse 27. And again, this is Jesus' pattern, is that really the last week of his life centers around the temple and his public ministry. And so he's been teaching. He will teach there. He will begin to instruct people, and this is what we reach tonight, is the question about authority. You can't read these verses 27 and following here, verse 233, without understanding what it means to have authority. And this is how that begins, verses 27 and 28. Mark chapter 11, verses 27 and 28. And it says this: "And they," that is Jesus and the disciples, "came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him." And in verse 28 it says this: "They began saying to him, 'By what authority are you doing these things?' Or, 'Who gave you this authority to do these things?'" And so you have not just a single question, but kind of a harassing challenge following Jesus around the temple area, challenging them with these statements like the ones that you read in verse 28. And you have to understand again, and we've made this pretty clear, but we'll repeat it here, is that Jesus has invaded the temple, and he has taken control of the temple away from the three groups, especially that you see in verse 27. Okay? Three groups listed in verse 27, starting with the chief priests. That's one group. That's the highest level of authority in the religious structure of Judaism. You have the scribes. There's another level of rank or authority that exists in the Jewish system. And the elders, a third version of authority there that exists in their culture and religious life. The elders, and kind of together, and you want to include the Pharisees and others, and you get to their ruling body of leaders in the whole of the Israel that are really described there in verse 27. And so what you see coming against Jesus and challenging Jesus are the highest levels of authority that exist in the nation of Israel. And they're not happy with Jesus because Jesus has taken away and challenged their business structure. That involves the clearing of the temple from buying and selling goods. And, this is what he would not let them do. Mark 11:16, he would not permit anyone to carry goods through the temple. So, and again, you have to understand the size and scope of the temple. We're not talking about a church building, even our church building, which is pretty big, right? Imagine trying to control everything that happens in a building this big, but we're talking about a stadium-sized place, going down to where they play the football or something and controlling that area, This is a pretty big area that he's not allowing anybody to come in and buy and sell goods in. And it seems to hold, for these couple of days that this, he's really caused a major disruption to them in this way. Not only that, but Jesus now is going to be teaching in the temple. This is the place where the high priests and the scribes would teach. And this was the seat of their perceived authority that they would, from the temple, meant something pretty significant to them, right? This is the equivalent of their capital, right? The very center point and focal point of their whole religion. They would claim that their authority, this is what they would claim, they would claim that their authority comes from God by virtue of the fact that they control the temple, that they have access to the temple. And so now Jesus has come in, and it says in verse 27, he's been walking through the temple. That is, he's going places around the temple, and pretty freely. That's just an expression, I think, of the freedom of his ability to move around the temple. And they're going to challenge him with the issue of authority. They perceive they have the authority. They perceive that Jesus is challenging them. So they come to him with a question that's pretty interesting. And it's going to bring out more about what they think about authority than anything else. You're going to understand at the end how they think about authority. And but this is the question that they bring in verse 28. By what authority are you doing these things? Tell us, behind the scenes and higher than you, what authority do you get from this, right? What authority do you have, or what permission, what allowance, who has told you that you could do these things, right? That's kind of where they're getting. And again, they're just saying these things. What is that? That's everything. Everything Jesus does. Everything that he's taught. Every miracle that he's committed. Every act on the Sabbath that they've disallowed and challenged him on. And why? How can you do any of these things, right? Name it. We've got 11 chapters of things that they didn't like. So, all of these things, right? And so they give him, and he gives an example, and what he says in verse 28, and they began saying to him, this is a repeated challenge to Jesus about how he is doing the things that he's doing. One, they probably can't understand how he's getting away with it, and they can't do anything about it. They probably feel a little powerless in this, because in their minds, they should have been able to kick him right out, and they can't. They should have been able to stop him from doing these things, and they don't know how. We're going to see a little bit about that. But so they have to come up to him, and they want to ask him exactly, by what authority are you doing these things, right? It's a question about, what is the source? What is the source, right? They don't just ask, why are you doing these things? They're asking, what is the source of your permission or authority? Really, to have authority is to have the freedom to do what you want. You have a sphere of choices that you can make within, the authority given to you. And they're saying, well, who's given it to you? They're really looking to back it up one step and say, who's given it to you? Right? Because Jesus is doing a lot of things they would never do. Jesus is teaching in a way that they don't teach. They don't have it. And so they want to know about it, because everything that Jesus does, everything that Jesus says and does, we'll get the right grammar, is filled with authority. It's filled with authority, and they know it, and the people know it. Remember earlier in Mark, but even Matthew, Mark, they all bring it out. Matthew 7:29 says he was teaching them as one having authority, right? Even the way that he would teach the people, it was recognized as this. He teaches it as if he wrote it. He teaches it if he knows it, and he can just tell us what it means. What is that? Why is that different? Because it says, and not as their scribes. Remember, the scribes are coming up to him too and saying, by what authority do you do these things? Scribes are their teachers. They're interpreters. They're the ones who get into the little details and tell you the meaning of things in the Word. In the Old Testament, right? They pick out all the little laws, and they tell you how to live them out, and they tell you what's permissible and not permissible, and and Jesus has picked at them. They swat at little gnats, right, in the law, and they says the little details, and so they want to know, how do you teach like that with authority, as if you can explain it better than us, right? You know more about the Scriptures than us. We're the scribes. We're the authority of the Word, and you teach something different. They would have come after him for the authority by the way he teaches, right? He can teach it and tell the meaning of the Scriptures because he actually did write it. But and he knows the meaning of it. And see, what they would have said is, this is how a scribe would have taught the word. They would have said, oh, here's an interpretation that you should follow. And by the way, I can back that up with the authority of, like, rabbis of the past. Here's the authoritative names, the names that you should recognize, why you should follow this interpretation, right? They have a perceived authority that not of their own, but they try to back it up by saying, well, we have these teachers who have taught us in the past, and we should just follow it, right? That's why you should believe it, you know. And Jesus just says, here's the meaning of the scripture, plain and simple, follow it, right? We don't have to quote, Jesus didn't have to quote him. I have to quote people at times to back up what I say. That's fine. I'll compare what I teach with what other people teach and try to arrive at the meaning of scripture. But their point is just, it's a perception of just man-made authority. And we're going to hit at that in more. Jesus' miracles, right? Jesus' miracles were taught as a display of his authority, right? When Jesus would calm the storm, they would say, wow, what authority is this that Jesus has command over creation? He could just tell the storm to stop, and it has to obey him. That's a measure of authority. And they would recognize that. Jesus, again, Matthew chapter 9, when he heals a paralyzed man, and this is what he says in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 6. He heals a paralyzed man there, and he says, but in order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, there's a big measure of authority, right? I can say I can forgive sins, but I can demonstrate the authority of it too by how? Rising up, take your bed and walk, right? So he says, this, he's challenging about his authority, right? And here's the outcome of it. If you look at Matthew 9:8, it says, when the multitude saw this, they were filled with awe and glorified God. Why? Who had given such authority to men. So there should be in the minds of the people, and when they see what Jesus does, that they understand this. The authority that he does what he does comes from men because God gave it to him. This is what they should recognize about Jesus. Jesus as a man doing these things, they should at least see that authority that he just healed a paralyzed man and claimed to be able to forgive sins comes from, as its source, God. This is what the leaders fail to see, but the people, when he demonstrates his authority, can see it. Right? There's lots of different ways that Jesus talks about his authority. In John chapter 5, he talks about the authority to execute judgment. So John chapter 5 and verse 27, there very simply he says, in God the Father, he gave him authority, the Son, to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Right? So there is a responsibility of being the Messiah, of being the Son of Man, that comes with this, that the Father delegates or gives this sphere of authority to execute judgment. So the coming judgment, the coming return of Christ and the ability to execute judgment is from the Father, given to him for a purpose. And so he has that measure of authority. Not only that, but there is no authority that Jesus doesn't have. After the resurrection, Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18, Jesus would come up to the disciples and say to them, all authority has been given to me, both in heaven and on earth. So, at the point of the resurrection, Jesus there just claims that he has all authority in heaven and on earth. Their question is, who gave you this authority? Because they don't know or understand or recognize the source of where that is coming from the Father. They don't recognize the source of the things that Jesus has said and taught and the miracles and signs that he's done as coming from the Father. Right? They're looking for something a little different. When you read that back in Mark chapter 11 and verse 28, when they said, by what authority, they're asking a question like, what school did you go to? Right? What partnerships and alliances have you made in this to give you the ability to do and have this kind of freedom, teaching and signs and right? They're asking, ultimately, the second question I think is probably more accurate. Who? They ask about a person. Who gave you this authority? to do these things. And again, it's about source. It's about the source of his authority. They mean a version of a human authority, right? Like Paul would say about his credentials at one point, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees, I was trained in a certain rabbinic tradition. He has all this backup of credentials. This is what they're looking for from Jesus, right? They want to know, you're a lone ranger, you're all by yourself, you're not connected to any structure, human structure, Jewish structure of authority that exists today. He doesn't connect to the high priests, right? He doesn't claim to have any authority or permission from them. He doesn't work within the sphere of the scribes. He doesn't ask permission of the elders. We know that he doesn't get along with the Pharisees. And there are no Pharisees that exist. And, Jesus' disciples themselves following around have no credentials. They're not anybody of importance. They weren't trained by anybody, right? They don't have any kind of credential or authority tied to them to speak of about this. So they want to know about Jesus coming into Jerusalem, coming into the temple, taking the temple and clearing it out and teaching from the temple. Who gave you this authority? Who is it? Give us a name. He actually does give them a name, but we'll get there. Verse 29, Jesus responds, and we'll just kind of take it from there. And Jesus responds to, and he proposes a fair exchange of ideas here. An answer for an answer. And if they would think it through, if they were to answer genuinely and true, they would have come up to the right conclusion. But because they can't answer truthfully, they walk away frustrated. But this is what Jesus says in Mark chapter 11 and verse 29. Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question, and you will answer me. And then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Right? So Jesus would have gladly told them by what authority he does these things. If they had answered correctly here, Jesus would have said, there's your answer. But they don't. And so he challenges them this way, and the question that he asks them in verse 30 is simply this. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Answer me. There's a pretty authoritative ending to a question, right? Answer me. Sounds pretty serious. But this is how Jesus challenges them back. And this is a public. Remember, where are they at is that they're walking around in the temple. Again, the temple has big open courtyards, and what would happen is the normal procedure would be this. You would pick an area or a corner or an open space, and you could begin teaching and gather your crowd around you in this area. You could have several people teaching. It's big enough. You could have somebody on the other side teaching. You could be over on this side teaching and not probably even interrupt each other. You could have, and this was a common thing for rabbis to do, is to show up and start a class and have this time of instruction. But Jesus here is just walking in a public space, if you will, public area of the temple, and the leaders come up. Remember, this is probably a larger group. It's in the plural, chief priests, plural, scribes, plural, elders, plural. So at least 6, right? Just from that. You have a group of at least 6 people and probably a dozen coming up and challenging him to say, hey, we want to know. Jesus puts it back on them and says, I need an answer from you, right? Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Now, that in itself, the way Jesus sets up his response here, tells you exactly the only 2 choices you have. Authority is either going to come from heaven, that would be the right authority, or from men. This is the authority they're actually looking for. And this is going to come out, right? So the way that Jesus challenges them here and he sets it up, there's only 2 choices of authority, from heaven or from men. So the question itself actually answers. If they were to answer correctly, they would need no answer from Jesus. They wouldn't need it. And so Jesus sets it up and he asks a very simple thing. It's a setup, it is. And he's challenging them because he knows And he knows that they won't answer correctly, right? And the real question is this, the underlying question is this: do the leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, do they recognize authority itself as coming from God or from men? Where do they see their own authority coming from? Where do they understand it to come from? Do they perceive in some way that their own authority comes from God? Ultimately, they recognize it as of themselves. They recognize it as a man-made authority. They're asking Jesus about the level of man-made authority that he has versus their man-made authority, and Jesus elevates and says that actually you need to know that it comes from God. Authority doesn't exist in the human realm without coming from God. That's the reality about authority, right? They don't see this. They're spiritually blind to it. Have they had any genuine concern about their own authority as coming from God, they would have had no problem answering and saying, our authority comes from God. We don't know where yours. They don't do this here. They don't answer. Sometimes they'll answer about, coming from their reliance on the law of Moses or, their insistence on following the law, but they don't do that here. They just begin reasoning among themselves in Mark chapter 11 and verse 31. So, in this encounter now, you have to take a pause in a minute and give them a chance to think. So, they don't answer right away. So they have to back away, and now they have to go into their huddle, right? Super Bowl week, we huddle. So, and now they have to say, okay, how are we going to answer this one, guys? How are we going to do it, right? Let's share some thoughts in this. They're reasoning among themselves. And I think this is out loud. They're saying these things because they're talking to each other. I think they backed away from Jesus and they're saying, all right, guys, what do? We have choices here. Here's your choices. If we say from heaven, that would be the correct answer. Well, he will say, then why did you not believe him? Right? See, none of the leaders who stayed leaders, if you put it this way, would recognize John's authority as coming from heaven. Right? Otherwise, they would have followed him. They would have listened to him. And they know this. Look they have it right there. They know this in their heart somewhere, and this is how apologetics works, by the way. They know the truth. They know the truth. And Jesus is pushing them back and saying, you already know the answer is true. John's authority from heaven, right? The baptism of John from heaven. And they said, if we say that, then it would have logically followed that we should have believed him and listened to him and done what he said. And they know that. There's no broken logic here. We should have known it was from heaven. We should have followed him and believed him. But that would have pushed against our own authority, our man-made authority, and we weren't ready to give that up, so we did not. Right? So they already have the right answer. And the right answer is the very reason, their inability to answer correctly here is the very reason Jesus has pronounced a curse on the temple. It's the very reason that he has declared that the temple will not continue to stand, right, and that it will be soon destroyed, right? In Luke 19:43, this is what he says. Here's a pronouncement of judgment about this, and here's why. He says, days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a bank before you and surround you and hem you in on every side and will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another. Speaking about the temple system and the temple building itself. And here's the reason why. Here's what it says. Because you did not recognize. You didn't recognize the time of your visitation. You don't recognize the right authority. You don't recognize how Jesus is operating in the sphere of the correct authority. Right? It's their ability to analyze and to think properly about this time of their visitation. Right? This is what Jesus calls his earthly ministry, the time of his visitation, right? And this is because they don't recognize it, because they don't acknowledge it, because they don't submit to it. He has pronounced this serious judgment against this temple system, their temple system, and their authority. It's not going to continue. So they know, in verse 31, they can't answer the correct answer, but they know it's the correct answer. That's apologetics for you. The unbeliever knows in his heart the truth about God. They just don't want to acknowledge it or admit it's true. They don't want to submit to it. So here you have apologetics at work. We know the right answer, we're just not going to say it, because then we would have to give in to it. And we don't want to. That's the unbelieving heart. So they're reasoning this thing, but this is what they say instead. Verse 32, we shall say. We know the truth, but we're going to say something different. This is what they come up with. The highest leaders of Israel. But we shall say from men. Right? Because, and here's the ultimate answer. You got to interpret their response here. We're going to say from men because we're afraid of the crowds. We're afraid of the multitude. We're afraid of the people. For all consider John to have been a prophet indeed. Right? So they know the right answer. They know correctly that the answer is from heaven. They know that the people believe it. They themselves are not willing to believe it. They know that Jesus believes it. They know that's where he's aiming for. They're the only ones who aren't willing to acknowledge that structure of authority is coming from heaven. Here's the authority that they're interested in. Here's the authority that consumes their thoughts. It's in verse 32. They were afraid of the multitude because they needed permission from the people to continue doing what they were doing. Man-made authority. So without the acknowledgement and permission of the crowds, they could not have the position of influence that they have. If the people turned against them, they would lose their place. They're afraid of their removal of their man-made authority, so they won't answer correctly. They love the man-made authority, the authority that comes from themselves, and they are not willing to give it up. If you remember in the Gospel of John, they said, look, the fact that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead is an attack on our authority. If it keeps on going like this, they're going to remove our place and our position. They're concerned about that. They don't worry about it and say, well, if it's from God, nobody can take away our authority. They don't say that. Jesus says it. You couldn't do anything against me unless God allows it. Right? That's authority. When he confronts the Romans, he says, you couldn't do anything against me unless God allows it. But they're not willing to acknowledge it. Here's a statement from the Pharisees about the baptism of John. A statement from the Pharisees about the baptism of John. Look at Luke chapter 7 and verse 30. Luke chapter 7 and verse 30. It says, but the Pharisees and lawyers, they did something. They rejected God's purpose for themselves, not having been baptized by John. So if you push it back to Jesus' question about the baptism of John from heaven, they would have said, we reject that. And then it's just interesting because it says this, concerning from heaven, they rejected God's purpose for themselves. Back it up and reverse that statement for a second, and this is an interesting fact. We always look at Pharisees as the bad guys, and to a point they are. If you read that verse properly in Luke chapter 7 and verse 30, it says something about them. It said God had a purpose for them. Think about that for a minute. The authority that they actually do have, the influence that they have among the people, there is a sliver of that is God's purpose for themselves. They would have been walking in that purpose had they recognized John's baptism and had a purpose and a place in the will of God among the people. We look at Pharisees as these pretenders, and they are. Hypocrites, and they are. But you have to acknowledge that even with that, they could have had a position of ministering in the purpose of God, hypothetically, had they recognized John's baptism as genuine and true. There was a purpose of God in that they rejected. A path of following that would have given them a place of authority from God. So, how do we think about this, right? How do we think about this whole, they're not willing to answer this, right? And they don't want to speak against the crowds because of their man-made position, challenging Jesus about his heaven-derived position. Right? Really, it's to recognize and live under the authority of God. We have to understand that every avenue and area of our life exists. We live in spheres of authority. We live with spheres of places where people exercise authority over us. God is the giver of authority, both legitimate and illegitimate, if you will, right? If you think about it this way, we are to be able to understand that. Romans 13:1 says, let every person be in subjection to what? Governing authorities. Which one? All of them. But at the county level, at the state level, all those different levels. It doesn't pick one of them. It's just we recognize this. There are different areas of governing authorities that exist in culture, in the world. But what do we recognize? That there is no authority except from God. That's what we recognize. That's what we live under. Right? We as Christians know this. We have to live in a certain way, and we have to understand this. Those that exist, only the good ones, are established by God. We have crummy levels of a crummy exercising of authority all around us, but we have to recognize this. They exist because God allows them to exist. God can deal with crummy authority. We don't have to rebel and sin against it. We need to learn how to live within it in obedience to God, understanding that they're given by Him, right? So we want to live this way, and we want to understand the exercising of authority. We know that God gives all authority. Just like the whole outbreak of COVID, that was an exercise of authority, right? If they wanted to say to us, shut your church down, we understood a different authority. We have an authority from heaven. It's not from men. We knew what God would call us to do. You have to understand at times, right, what the levels of authority exist for and what they're established for. God has a level of authority in the church to tell us and instruct us what to do. To the degree that we live in the world, we recognize their authority, and we live in subjection to it. When it comes up to disobedience to God, we understand and recognize God's authority. Here, the leaders of Israel, pushing in this way to Jesus, saying, by who gave you this authority? If he would have just said from heaven, they would have got upset. But they don't even understand what authority from heaven looks like. They don't even know what it is. It would have been a challenge and a threat to them if he had just came out and said it, because they don't have it. They would have been jealous of it. And they are jealous of it. They would greatly desire it, but they don't even know what it is. They're spiritually blind. But because of their unwillingness to answer, the correct answer would have given them the correct viewpoint. And they already understood the correct application. We should believe it. We should believe in him. If he has the right authority, then we should logically believe in him. But because we don't want to believe in him, we will not acknowledge his authority. That's what it comes down to. They know the truth in their heart, but they don't want to acknowledge it or give credit to it, because then that would call them to obedience, and they don't want to give it. This is the unbelieving heart. This is what they've done. They recognized the people, John, to have been a prophet indeed, but they're not willing to acknowledge it, because then they understand the correct application would be submission to it. A different authority that they don't want to submit to. The one that Jesus exists in. So in verse 33, closing it out, it says this, answering Jesus, they said, we do not know. That's their answer. That's the agnostic answer, if you will. There's an agnostic existence of an answer. We just don't know. We don't know how to tell. We don't know how to analyze. We don't know how to think and reason about this. It's just this thing out there that's unknowable, right? If you ever get that answer about knowing God, right? We just can't know, right? Yes, you can, and you know in your heart you can. God just proved it here. These leaders of Israel knew the truth and were not willing to acknowledge it, so they come up with the stupid answer, we don't know. This is apologetics. They're really pushing against the truth that they know in their heart and don't want to submit to. And so in verse 33, the answer, we don't know, gives Jesus the ability to tell them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Challenge subverted. They want to stop him from doing what he's doing, so they challenge him and say, you have no authority to do these things. At the end of the day, they have to back away and say, yeah, we just don't know. We can't stop you. They can't. It's a failed attempt on their part to be able to come and stop him from doing what he's doing. It's an issue of authority that they're unwilling to recognize. Jesus pushes back and says, if you know the truth of God in your heart, then believe it. And they said, nope, we don't want to. We don't want to, so we'll back away. We'd rather back away and say we don't know than to push it to the point where we recognize that it's the truth and we're just disobedient. They won't go there. So with that, let's just close and think about that again as an exercise of being bold for the truth, right? And understanding of the heart of an unbeliever, knowing the truth and rebelling against it. But we'll go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for this display. Thank you for understanding the issue of authority in our own lives, recognizing your lordship in our lives and submitting to it. We acknowledge the truth gladly, freely, that you are Lord and that you have all authority given to you in heaven and on earth. And we want to live under that authority. We want others to live under it. We want to proclaim the truth to bring people into submission to your authority through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Help us not only to preach it and to proclaim it, but to demonstrate it in our lives as well. And Lord, we ask in your name. Amen.